Another 5 minutes. Recording. Yes, thank you. So welcome everybody. We're very happy to see you here today for this seminar. I would like to welcome you also on behalf of the social science group within the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage of the University of Foscari. This is, as some of you may know, the first of a new series of seminars, which we have been thinking about for quite some time. And the idea of this series of seminar is to bring together the diverse research and cultural, intellectual interests of the different members of our group within the department, and to try and involve other scholars, other colleagues in the department, but also broader speaking at the university where we are based, and to involve a wider public. So the format that we have chosen for these seminars is to have always one somebody whom we invite from outside, who's talking about a topic that some of us has thought might be interesting for a wider public, and one of us is going to be a discussant of this presentation. I'm not going to talk about today's topic because that's Federica Timeta's work. She will intervene right after me. I only want to mention that the spirit of this series of seminar is that of enhancing cooperation and working together with other groups, institutions, and colleagues. So, for instance, this very first seminar has been organized together with the Center for Humanities and Social Change, which we thank for the cooperation. And I would also like to thank especially Maurizio Busacca and Francesco Della Pupa for taking care of the setting up of the series of seminars and the organization, which we hope will encounter your interest. And we're also very much looking forward to listening to your feedback in the future. We have decided to make podcasts of the presentations to the seminars. So the meeting is being recorded, but what is being published as a podcast is only the first part of the meeting, which is the presentation by our guests. Whereas the second part, which is more Q&A, discussion, and so on, will not be published. And we thought this might be more protective of everybody's privacy, so to say, as well. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you again. I'm very happy to see that there's quite some people, which means that we have attracted some attention. That's already something. And so I wish everybody a good seminar today. And we will make sure that you get our invitations for the future editions of this series of seminars. Thank you very much and enjoy. Federica.
So thank you, Barbara, and thank you. We are greatly honored to have Corey Wrenn as our first guest of the cycle of seminars in social sciences at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage. I will very briefly introduce Professor Wrenn, and then I'll give the floor to her for her presentation. And then, as Barbara already said, we will have plenty of time for the Q&A moment. So be sure to write if you want your questions in the chat, or take note of them, and then you can participate in the discussion. So Professor Wrenn is a UK-based American sociologist. She works as a lecturer of sociology at the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research at the University of Kent. And she is the co-founder of the International Association of Vegan Sociologists, apart from having served as a council member with the American Sociological Association's Animal and Society section, and being elected chair in 2018. She's published with many international journals, academic and not. She has a very interesting and very informative blog as well. And she's the author of many important books, among them A Rational Approach to Animal Rights, Extensions in Abolitionist Theory, and Piecemeal Products, Animal Rights in the Age of Nonprofits. Her new book is forthcoming next July, and the title is Animals in Irish Society. So I turn it over to Professor Wrenn for her presentation, and I thank her again and the department for hosting us. Thank you.
Okay, can I verify that you can see my PowerPoint?
We see the PowerPoint very well.
Okay. I'm trying to get rid of all this stuff up here, but it won't let me. There we go. Okay, so hopefully it won't be too disruptive for whatever reason. When people are coming into the waiting room, the dings are coming through me. So it might be a little orchestration in the background. So thank you very, very much for inviting me to be the first speaker. It's extremely exciting, and I'm very, very honored to be here, especially because I know very well that this topic area is a little bit radical, and it's definitely on the frontier of sociological thought and practice. So I'm really, really pleased that you all would give me the opportunity to share with you what is really a developing and emerging field. And putting together this presentation was actually a bit challenging, as well as fun, because it's coming into fruition right before our eyes. As Federica mentioned, the International Association of Vegan Sociologists, this just came out we formed this last year with the recognition that this is a new field of sociology with a lot of people who are starting to work in this area and don't always find the institutional or professional support for that. And I do have to give thanks to Federica for not just inviting me to speak today, but also being a key part of that organization and helping also with translations into Italian. And before I forget, I think this is one of the major areas of growth I'd like to see in vegan sociology, is moving out of the United States, moving out of the UK, and looking to see what other parts of the world can offer this field. So yeah, my aim in this presentation, I hope not to talk more than 45 minutes, is to introduce this new field. We're going to also make a case for why this matters, why non-human animals matter. Not going to talk too much about this, but just in case you're curious, since we are in an Italian university, I will just briefly give you an idea of what's the scene in Italy. And I think perhaps people in the audience will have more up-to-date information on that if you want to share that in the Q&A. I also am going to make sure that this presentation is a little practical, so you can learn something from this and use it in your own research, in your own writing, whether or not you're vegan. I think everyone could really benefit from this. And then also, I'd like this to be reciprocal. If, you know, as you're watching this presentation, it sparks something in you from your field of work or your region, and you think that this field can benefit from that, or I could benefit from that, definitely make use of that Q&A for some back and forth there. Okay, Doug. So the first thing I think I need to do is to build the case about why we should care about non-human animals as social scientists, as philosophers. Unfortunately, sociology as a discipline has been deeply, deeply anthropocentric, and this goes back really to the beginning. There's a sociologist named Kay Peggs who will pop up later in this presentation, and she wrote a book, Sociology and Animals, and she looked at some of the core textbooks that are given to students on sociology, like introductory sociology, and found that many of those definitions were quite explicitly human-centric. So for instance, Nasionis and Plummer which is the big textbook. I know that I used that when I first started teaching in the United States. It was the one that most of the universities used. But then even in the UK, this is a major textbook that is used. And right in their definition of what is sociology, they're talking about the systematic study of human society. So explicitly in that definition, excluding other animals. Another textbook says that it's about the systematic study of patterns of human interaction. But looking back even further to the classic theorists who were the ones who formed the discipline 150 years ago or so, Max Weber, for instance, was very critical of the kind of push for objectivity in science, because he recognized, writing in Germany at a very tumultuous time, that a lot of history, in fact, in science was actually informed by subjectivity, people's personal or political biases. And so he was very crucial at the beginning of forming sociology to push for a recognition of the subjective. Unfortunately for non-human animals, there's a belief that they don't have a subjective experience. If animals lack that subjectivity, that's or they are believed to lack that subjectivity. That's one reason why we may not see them included in sociology. Likewise, going back even further to Karl Marx, Marx didn't have a lot to say about other animals, but he did have a lot to say about the human species and the species being. And he did write a tiny bit about how he thought that non-human animals lacked that ability to contemplate, step back, think about their actions before building and laboring and creating. So even back as far as Marx, we see this divide between humans and other animals had been formed. Bouncing back a little bit further to the turn of the 20th century with the rise of symbolic interactionalism, Mead also excluded non-human animals, thinking that they lack the capacity to recognize significant or complex symbols, and so that would really differentiate humans. And in fact, I have to point to this as well as the reason why I actually got into the field that I'm in, because I remember when I was a graduate student and we were learning these theories, and it didn't make sense to me that non-human animals weren't able to recognize symbols or engage in complex languages. And I pushed back on that in the discussions we had in the classroom. And it really did spark an interest in why does sociology not include non-human animals? It just doesn't seem altogether logical. Well, the main reason why sociology is really excluding non-human animals is this just underlying anthropocentrism. So, in course sociology, where you're teaching students, the different perspectives, the conflict perspectives, symbolic interactionalism, functionalism, we're also teaching them another perspective, and that's anthropocentrism. And what that means is literally humans are at the center of the world, the center of the study, the center of sociology. So that pushes other animals that we live with, animals that we use for food, animals that we use in medicine, animals that are literally all throughout our society. They're pushed to the margins in sociology. And there is a deep, deep human bias. And it really becomes taken for granted that humans are the perfection of evolution, that humans are the most advanced species, the most important species. And of course we think that because we're humans. So when we're looking at a vegan sociology, we're starting to unpack the taken for grantedness of this human-centered anthropocentrism. Historically, this anthropocentrism, when challenged, would justify itself and say, well, humans are more rational. Humans have culture. Humans have complex languages. But it doesn't take a lot of critical thinking to recognize how these things that make us distinctive as a human species are actually shared by a lot of other species. So when we push comes to shove, anthropocentrism really doesn't hold a lot of weight. So one of my favorite theorists when we're looking at the origins of this discipline is, again, a UK scholar named Kay Peggs. And she challenged that anthropocentrism. So actually, when we look at it, this is really a lot to do with opinion, choices, judgments, and this essentialist difference between humans and other animals is really blown out of proportion. And as sociologists, we already challenge that when we're looking at the construction of race, the construction of gender, other identities. We recognize that historically we've made the case that these are essential differences based in nature, based in biology, but actually a lot of it is really performative. A lot of it is symbolic. A lot of it is socially constructed and socialized. And this division between humans and other animals, likewise, is quite artificial. So in vegan sociology, one of the first things that we seek to do is to challenge that division and recognize it as something that is a chosen division, a constructed division. So indeed, humanity, then we can start to see that as a performative identity. It's something that we do. It's something that we engage in. Of course, it's going to be influenced by the social structure we live in as well. But just like the work of Judith Butler encouraged us to think about the performance of gender, we can also apply that to the performance of humanity. We can also look at animality. I know kind of a jargon word here, but kind of the opposite to humanity, animality. We can look at that as a symbolic category. And that is really key there because as talk about intersections later in this lecture, animality has been used to symbolically otherize human groups as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, about how Black and brown people have been called animals, or women have been turned into meat, right? So the animality becomes a symbolic category, not just for non-human animals, but for marginalized humans as well. So indeed, we see when we create these identities, in the case of humans and other animals, we don't have a rainbow of identities where we all kind of live together and we're all different and wonderful different ways. We have instead a hierarchy where some identities are given more privilege than others. And in addition to that, we also have this more core issue of binaries. So, you know, as sociologists, we're always trying to unpack these artificial binaries that we create. The social world is not so simplistic. It's much more complex than that. But we as a society, human society, we really love those binaries because it helps us support those hierarchies of difference. It helps us support a system based on oppression. This us and them, humans and everything else, and everyone else. So again, a lot of these differences that we create, we whip up to say that this is what makes humans so much better and distinctive and worthy of all this privilege and power. We can unpack a lot of those and find that a lot of them really don't hold a lot of weight. But ultimately, and this picture here, this meme is a very, very popular kind of motto, quote that's used in the animal rights movement. Because it's asking us, you know, get away from how smart are these animals, or how advanced evolutionarily are these animals, or do they look like us, or they act like us. Maybe we don't need to worry so much about all of that. At the core of this, most fundamentally, do they suffer? Are they self-aware? Are they sentient? Do they have a capacity for pleasure and pain? If so, really, that's all it should matter then for sociologists to want to pay attention to the plight of other animals. So I'm going to be, when I'm talking about vegan sociology, you'll probably notice that a lot of this is kind of based in a conflict perspective. And indeed, we do focus quite a lot on animals who are used in exploitative, violent ways. But even if you're not swayed by that and you think it's totally fine that we use animals in violent ways, I think that any sociologist worth their weight in salt would want to pay attention to the role that non-human animals have played in the development and the maintenance of human societies. All throughout history, all the various different economic modes of production, reaching all the way back to the hunting and gathering period, they've been based on the exploitation of animals. So the development of human society has so much to thank. We're in great debt to non-human animals for all that they've contributed in so many complex ways that I just don't have time to go through in this lecture, but hopefully that gets your imagination going. We should also care, because for many sociologists, we care about inequality and injustice. And if that's the case, we should care about non-human animals because they are, without a doubt, the largest minority group in the world, the largest oppressed group in the world. Some people would take issue with the term minority because they're actually the majority. But politically, they're in the minority, and they are certainly the largest oppressed group. Just looking for fun at the weight, the actual weight, if we wanted to use that as a measurement, most of the biomass on the globe is non-human. So they're taking up most of the life on the planet is not human. So we should maybe want to pay attention to the majority experience. Interestingly, also, it's not just that non-human animals make up most of the biomass. that most of the biomass on Earth, that it's non-human, is non-humans that we have brought into existence specifically to exploit, kill, and use. So this is a massive, massive, massive scale of violence and oppression. And I think sociologists really do, if they take these values seriously and what the core premises of sociology are really about, I think it really is important that we pay attention to non-human animals. And as I mentioned also, there's a deep entanglement. What happens in non-human animals does not happen to animals alone. We often see that the oppression of non-human animals is entangled with sexism, with racism, classism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism, and so on and so forth. And there's a large body of research that's now emerging to support these really fascinating, not just theoretical, evidence-based intersections. And if you were a sociologist who's really interested in race, class, gender, or so on, it really would broaden your horizons significantly if you were to look at non-human animals and how their experiences influence, shape the experiences of other humans, and vice versa. It's a reciprocal entanglement. And then also, even at the more intimate level, for those who are interested in just studying smaller microcosmal or micro level interactions, non-human animals share our homes. They've become part of our families. They're a major part of our social lives. So for me, for instance, I live alone. I don't live alone. I have a dog and I have a cat, and they are a major part of my life. They share the bed with me. They hang out on the sofa with me and watch Netflix with me. We go on walks and adventures together. These are my family members. And for many, many people in the world, they have a similar experience. So sociologically, there's so much there that we could unpack. And it really just does not make any sense whatsoever that animals are so integrated into human life. And then we decide that because we are only focused on human interactions and human systems, that we don't care about other animals. It just doesn't make sense. All right, so that was my case about why we might want to care, even if you're not vegan, even if you don't care about animals, you've never thought really about animals before. I think if you care about social science, a good social science, there's a lot there. There's a lot of good evidence there that animals matter. So now I want to introduce the field. So a lot of people like me have also recognized that, wow, there's so much going on. There's so much that needs to be unpacked, so much that needs to be researched. And it's a complicated interdisciplinary journey, the way we got here. If I had to say, what is the major field that really influenced us thinking about this? I'd probably say philosophy. Philosophy, although historically has been a very male-centric, white-centric, Eurocentric type of discipline, it was really on the frontier for taking animal ethics seriously. So a lot of other disciplines were majorly informed by animal ethicists such as Peter Singer, such as Tom Reagan. And then there's also ecofeminism. The ecofeminist field emerged about the same time, also out of philosophy, but also, of course, out of feminism and environmental studies. And that was a major field that starts to unpack not just gender relations, but oppressive relations in general. And there's starting to become a space where many of these ecofeminists were also exploring the relationship with other animals. And this, of course, would also branch off into vegan feminism, which is another field that I specialize in and is also really fascinating. So folks like Carol Adams or Marty Keel would be included in that, or Greta Gard. So that then leads us to human animal studies. This is a deeply, deeply intersectional field that encompasses lots and lots of different disciplines, such as political science, philosophy, the humanities, communication studies, media studies, and so on and so forth. But I'm trying to hone it down to sociology. How do we get to sociology? Well, posthumanism is a major field that emerged out of that. I would say this is more firmly in the humanities, but it did get us thinking quite critically about that false divide between humans and other animals. So Donna Haraway was a very famous contributor to that field, although I think that she doesn't even self-identify as a posthumanist, but she's a posthumanist. Animality studies, so emerging out of that. And again, this is still in the humanities. Michael Lundblad, I think, is an important scholar in that field. And again, that animality bit, I think, is really key. I've found that that's been very, very useful in a lot of my critical sociological work. Then more recently, we have vegan studies. And vegan studies is actually very recent. I just happen to have this on my desk. The Reader in Vegan Studies just came out. If you want to check that out, I have a chapter in that, as many of the scholars in the field do. Many sociologists are in this book. But Laura Wright first wrote a book on vegan studies, I think in 2015. And so this is really, really new stuff. And then I have to also talk about critical animal studies, which is overlaps with a lot of those, but like vegan studies, it's very much so about recognizing inequalities and challenging those inequalities. I'm going to come back to critical animal studies, but just really quickly, sociology wasn't out on its own. Sociology also had some contributions to this new field of vegan sociology, of course. So within critical sociology, there's the rise of society and animals. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about that in a couple slides. Intersectionality, as you've probably already figured out, is a major, major influence on vegan sociology and also environmental sociology. In fact, a lot of vegan sociologists are also practicing environmental sociologists, publishing in both spaces. I know as when I was a chair of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association, it seemed like half of our membership were also members of the environmental sociology group. So that's a major, major area of overlap. And in case you weren't aware, as I didn't include this in the slideshow thus far, but the use of non-human animals is one of the leading contributors to climate change. And then also food studies bridges those two fields. All right, so back to critical animal studies. So this is a field that has been around for, I don't know, maybe about 20 years or so. And very interestingly, sociologists have really been at the forefront of that. So these are two of the major books that first came out, both in 2014, Defining Critical Animal Studies. Anthony Nocella is a sociologist. John Sorensen is a sociologist. We have The Rise of Critical Animal Studies, also that year, that was edited by Nick Taylor in Australia and Richard Twine in the UK, both sociologists. So sociologists really were at the forefront. But again, this is a deeply multidisciplinary sort of field. And we all know as scholars, it's good to have some of that stuff from everywhere, you know, incorporate stuff from everywhere. But also we know that sociology has a very distinctive emphasis, distinctive theories, and maybe could benefit from having its own space kind of develop and thrive. And critical animal studies also is not always vegan. So I know when vegan studies came out, you might think, well, what's the difference between critical animal studies and vegan studies? Well, vegan studies is really explicitly about veganism, whereas critical animal studies can talk about all kinds of different issues facing animals, but maybe not always about liberating them or not eating them. So in this book, by the way, it's a good thing I had it here, Elizabeth Cherry, who's one of the, I would say, the founding vegan sociologist who was writing works on vegan sociology 15 years ago. She has a chapter in this book, and she writes about the burgeoning of vegan studies and sociology. And she actually identifies and says, it really wasn't until sociology started to open up to food and animal issues, specifically with veganism and farmed animals, that vegan studies had space to thrive. So this is something that's unfurling right before our eyes. It's actually quite exciting for me as a scholar to be on top of this as it develops. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but just in case you're curious, so where did this happen in sociology? So this is brand new, right? It's about 20 years. The ASA forms an Animals and Society section in 2001 with folks like David Nybert, Jessica Greenbaum, and others. The BSA, the British Sociological Association, jumps on board 5 years later. That group is still active as well. Then the sociology group in Australia in 2017. So this is very, very recent, right? The Canadian Sociological Association creates an animal group in 2019. The Polish Sociological Association just last year. And then, of course, the International Association that I co-founded opened up last year as well. So this is extremely new, hot sociology. Just in case you're curious, I'm not going to go over the summaries of these, but here's some of those key texts that emerged at the very beginning of the field, helping to define not just sociology, sociology's take on critical animal studies, but these are vegan sociologists. So David Nybert's Animal Rights, Human Rights, about the entanglement of these oppressions. Leslie Irvine in Colorado, If You Tame Me. Erica Cudworth in the UK, Social Lives with Other Animals, is also a deeply intersectional book. Kay Peggs, again, here is with Animals and Sociology, really the key text that introduces the sociological thought and theory and applies it to critical animal studies. And then also Nick Taylor down in Australia, who does Humans, Animals, and Society, so 2013. So these are some of those core texts that help to define sociology's take on vegan studies. Okay, so here we go. What is vegan sociology after all? Some of you might not even know what veganism is. I think that when I first went vegan, like 21 years ago, you did have to explain what veganism was. I think nowadays more and more people are familiar with that, which is great. But just in case, this is a definition that's pushed by the Vegan Society, which has not really changed too much in the 70-some, 80 years that it's been around. It's a philosophy and a way of life, which tries to exclude basically all animal products, recognizing them as forms of oppression. The consumption of animals' bodies, body parts, excrements, their labor, it seemed to be an exploitative relationship, an oppressive relationship. And this, by the way, this is the very first, this picture you see here, the very first vegan news, the Vegan Journal, which was hand typed and hand distributed back in 1944. So this concept has really been in the works for some time now. So there's lots of different ways you might understand veganism. I think the most comprehensive way to look at it, especially when we're looking at it from sociological point of view, it's a political position. It's not just a diet. It's not just what you eat or don't eat. It's a political position. You might also see it as a philosophy. So in the United Kingdom, very excitingly, last year, it was recognized as an official philosophy and is now protected by law. Some people might see it just as a lifestyle. They don't really get involved in the philosophy or the politics, and they really are just about what you wear and what you eat. Some people see it as a key identity. So a lot of sociological research is in there about how understanding vegan identity. I would certainly see myself, that is a major part of my identity, being a vegan. And then kind of bouncing off that lifestyle choice bit, sometimes it's just, you're not even vegan and you just like, well, I like to buy makeup that's not tested on animals and it's not made of animal fat, or I like the vegan ice cream better, it's nicer on my stomach or whatever. So there's lots of different understandings of veganism. But again, I would say the political position tends to be the one that sociologists most commonly recognize it as, but also the philosophy part. So veganism actually has been around for some time. I know it's considered to be a fad or trendy, but veganism as a political position has been around at least since the early 1800s, believe it or not. The SPCA that formed in England in the 1820s, one of their very first presidents, Louis Gompertz, he was a practicing vegan. He wouldn't even use horse carts to get around London. There's also some early vegan practices or experiments in the United States. The Alcotts, the Louisa May Alcott, one of the authors of, or the author of a lot of important literature. It's actually a major part of the abolitionist movement in early 19th century America. And they applied that to also their veganism, and they had a vegan commune they called Fruitlands. So lots of interesting stuff that had been happening in the 1800s. But the Vegan Society actually forms in 1944 at the height of wartime, which is actually quite interesting, you would think. For a lot of social movements, nothing happens really during war. But a lot of the rationing, the atrocities, the kind of the lack of, really a lot of fear about where we get our food. Britain really was because of the bombardment and also because the merchant ships were being cut off by Germany. Food became really critical and people started to really reimagine their relationship to food. So actually before that, and 30 some years before that, they would actually been debating veganism in the Vegetarian Society. So just wanted to give you a little bit of history so you know this is not something new. This is something that people have been grappling with and considering and trying to put into practice for over 100 years. Not to say that this is completely in the West or Western, because we have other philosophical and religious practices of the world where veganism was part of that. For instance, the Vegan Society of the United States, the American Vegan Society, was very much so influenced by its original founder, who was a Jain, and he practiced ahimsa, and his ahimsa is not practicing nonviolence, and that was including non-human animals. So many Jains used to be practicing vegans. That is not so much the case today because of Westernization and the industrialization of our food system. But I just wanted to give a quick shout out there that the global majority historically has eaten a vegan or close to vegan diet. So this is not a completely Western experience. So yeah, this is starting to erode today because of Westernization, but I am seeing some research that's emerging that some cultural spaces like in Africa are actually resisting that, or are not, you know, they want to protect their culture and protect their foodways. So you might be wondering, why not vegetarianism? So why all this fuss about veganism? Well, they're totally different things. Vegetarianism typically is relating only to the consumption of meat, and it may or may not have anything to do with other practices that harm animals. So strictly speaking, vegetarianism might not have anything to do with vivisection, which is animal testing, and it happens to millions and millions and millions of animals across the world every single year. It may not cover entertainment. So if you've seen Blackfish, that was a good example of that, where the whales and the dolphins that are used in aquariums. Fashion, so leather, wool, fur, threats to wildlife, that has nothing to do with vegetarianism. And so lots of other food industries, the dairy industry, the egg industry. These are things that really, really cause monstrous harm to non-human animals. And veganism is really what you need to cover that. So veganism really is a blanket catch-all. If it's hurting other animals, if it affects other animals, veganism is intended to cover that. And just a side note, some of this vegetarianism, if you really question it and look up close to it, it doesn't always make sense. So in egg production, for instance, boy chickens, boy roosters, they can't make eggs. So the egg industry grinds them up alive as soon as they're hatched. And vegetarians who eat eggs are supporting the billions and billions of little boy chicks who are being ground up alive every year so that eggs can be made. Milk also, in order to make dairy products like cheese, baby cow stomach called rennet will be put into the cheese making process. So it's not even really vegetarian. The other problem with vegetarianism is that it's missing a lot of those key intersections. So for instance, I mentioned that gender and species have a lot of overlap. So there's a lot of sexual politics that we can unpack looking at the systematic exploitation of reproductive systems of cows and chickens and other animals. Also looking at the dairy industry and how it is an act of harm to the global majority who cannot digest lactose beyond the age of weaning. And we have Western corporations that are pushing these products onto them. The leather industry, which is deeply, deeply environmentally dangerous, but also harmful to Black and brown people who are poor or working in these industries and exposed to all those chemicals. The harassment of wildlife, it gets excluded. But that also deeply impacts people in spaces where, when we're looking at for instance, the pandemic, and we're looking at the wildlife trade there and how there's intersections with what happens to marginalized humans. If you've recently watched the documentary on Seaspiracy on Netflix, also showing a lot of those intersections. Yeah, and then also remember the climate change. Climate change is key here, and vegetarianism doesn't really get to a lot of those major polluting industries that use up a lot of water, a lot of grain, a lot of energy. So this is why veganism and not vegetarianism. So vegan sociology then, coming back to our definition. Vegan sociology explicitly recognizes non-human animals as persons who matter, that they have subjective experiences, that they are sentient. It also recognizes that humans have a responsibility. So this is that radical sociological history there, where we recognize that sociology is not just a cold calculating science, but there's human beings who are conducting this science, and we have a responsibility to other animals. And it's okay to be empathetic. It's okay to tune into that caring. Caring can be important for science as well. Also, vegan sociology is deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by feminist theories, critical race theories, and of course, environmental justice. And I actually asked some of my colleagues and people who subscribe to the International Association for Vegan Sociologists on Facebook and the newsletter, and I asked them, what do you think vegan sociology is? And that these are similar things that I keep hearing, that intersectionality, that anti-oppression. But Jessica Greenbaum, who's one of the founders of the Animals and Society section of the ASA, a good colleague of mine, her definition, I think is spot on. And she's basically saying that vegan sociology seeks to include non-human animals into the sociological imagination. And I love that bit, the sociological imagination. And we're advancing the cause of animal liberation. We're recognizing the intersectionality of oppression. So it's not just animals, it's an interconnection. This is a society we're all a part of. And looking for a cruelty-free world that is free of hierarchy, free of domination. So you can see some of that Marxism creeping into this. Not all vegan sociology is ascribed to Marxism, but I'd say there's a lot of kind of Marxist thought that informs some of it. So I would also identify two major veins of vegan sociology. I would say there's one vein is that it's animal centered. So the main aim here is to challenge human supremacy, center non-human animals, visibilize non-human animals. How can we effectively help non-human animals? So it's all about animals. But then there's also a bunch of sociology that's really about just the humans. What does it mean to be vegan? What is it like to be vegan? Identity politics around veganism. Food culture, a lot of food studies. You can do so much with that with veganism. What motivates people? What are your attitudes and your behaviors? And that also, there's an interesting sub-branch in social psychology. Whole lot of amazing research that's taking place there. Then there's also social movement politics. And this is where I do a lot of my work, where I don't actually do much, I don't write too much about animals at all. I do a lot of stuff about the human beings who are fighting on their behalf. So that's it. I wanted to just stop there because I'm getting close to my time. And in this last bit, I'm just going to zip through really quickly because this is not my area of expertise, but just in case you're curious, since we are speaking in Italy, what's the situation in Italy? Meat consumption, I think Italy is kind of similar to other places in the West. Meat consumption is a little bit down since the 2010s. Chicken consumption is increasing. That has a lot to do with the rationalization and industrialization of the food system. Chickens are just easier to quickly raise and kill and manipulate. And the numbers are just staggering, So 551 million in 2019. In the UK, it's about 1 billion. I think in the US, it's about 10 billion, billion with a B, every single year. Almost all are coming from factory farms, although advertising will convince consumers otherwise. Almost all these chickens are raised in the most horrific conditions. All conditions are horrific when you meet a slaughterhouse at the end, but factory farms, of course, are an extra level of torture. The number of pigs has slightly decreased. This is kind of a gotcha moment because ham is, of course, really, really popular in Italian cuisine. The number of pigs have been decreasing, not because people are eating less of their meat or their flesh, but because their bodies have been genetically manipulated so that they get bigger and bigger and grow more flesh. And so fewer of them have to be raised. So the body politics of what happens to non-human animals that we kill for food is another fascinating and horrific area of inquiry. Consumption of fishes is also on the increase. And if you've seen the film Seaspiracy, you can see why this would be really, really disturbing. And this is really because people are being told that white flesh is healthier when that's not necessarily the case, but these are the animals that have to pay the price, pigs and fishes. Dairy is now on actually on the decrease. This is another trend that's consistent with other parts of the West. And one of the reasons for that is because it makes people sick. And now there's increasingly more alternatives that are made from various plants that don't make people sick and aren't full of fat and cholesterol. So we are seeing the dairy industry has been taking a hit. Just to show you in numbers, and this is pulled from a recent study from last year, the numbers are just staggering. Numbers are just staggering. Okay, so here's the vegan. Here's a good part, the vegan part. The Italian situation is kind of wonky. It's just, I don't know if we can see a clear line of or trend. And maybe some of you have more up-to-date research on this. I had a lot of trouble. It's really, really difficult to find statistics on veganism anywhere. Italy is no exception. But it does seem that the numbers in Italy are relatively consistent with elsewhere in the West. So maybe around 2% or so of Italians are vegan. Maybe around 6, 7, 8% of them are vegetarian. Again, consistent with elsewhere. Very encouragingly, Veganuary, which is a 30-day Go Vegan challenge that happens in January every year, the numbers of subscribers has increased every year. And this lockdown, the year of lockdown, it was the highest yet. And the number 7 country for people signing up was actually Italy. And the number 4 city was Milan. So Italy is actually paying quite a lot of attention to this. So it's a place to watch. Another one of my colleagues has been doing a lot of research in the animal rights movement in Italy, and he's finding that the status of non-human animals are starting to grow. The movement politics mirror a lot of the politics that are happening elsewhere in the West. So you have a lot of emphasis on conservative protection, like make the cages slightly bigger, versus the smaller group of people who are like, can we just get rid of the cages altogether? So that's a divide that is kind of undergirding a lot of Western animal rights activism. There's also, again, the problem with greenwashing, convincing consumers that their milk comes from cows who are happy in lush rolling pastures, when that's absolutely not the case. Most animals live in really horrific conditions. But that greenwashing is really, really powerful in keeping people from going vegan. All right, so that's it. I'm at the conclusion, and I just want to quickly emphasize that this is a branch of sociology that's emerging out of critical animal studies, firmly sociological, but also firmly anti-speciesist, explicitly vegan. It's asking us to consider that identity is performative, and if so, can't we challenge what it means to be human? If that binary between humans and other animals has been socially, culturally constructed, can't we challenge it? Can't we destabilize that? Vegan sociology is ultimately about creating a vegan world, and that means total liberation. As long as some are not free, no one else can be free. So it's recognizing the intersectionality of oppression. It's explicitly moral. It's explicitly ethical. And this is something that makes it very radical. And a lot of people want to say, keep that out of my sociology. But, you know, Max Weber famously 100+ years ago said, you know, all of our science is ultimately going to be subjective. So why not just be open and honest about it? And then lastly, of course, vegan sociology is so deeply intersectional. This is not just about animals. This is about us. It's about life on Earth and how it interconnects. I think on the horizon, some of the things we want to be looking at is decentering whiteness, because a lot of the theory I've been showing you is by white people in the West. What does it mean when we have new identities that are in place there? Folks like AFCO, who apply the theory of Afrofuturism, what could that contribute? We want to work on building connections with other sociological fields like the environmental folks, race, class, gender folks. That divide has got to go. It doesn't serve us at all. We also might want to return to the classics. How can we expand on Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Gilman, Du Bois, and so on and so forth, and see how that speaks and advances our understanding of our relationships to other animals. We also need to be building new theory, not just looking backwards, but looking forwards. And I think part of that is also, you know, vegan sociology, just because of the nature of the stuff we're looking at, can be quite doom and gloom. But I think it is important to also look forward. What does it mean? What does a vegan world with total liberation look like? And how can we envision that? And how can we get there? I think that's also the job of sociology. That's the promise of sociology. So in my very last slide, I want to ask you then to think about how you can apply this to your own work, whether or not you're vegan. You should be vegan, consider going vegan, but even if you're not vegan, even if you don't really care too much about animals, I think that everyone's sociology, your social science, your philosophy, your field can be greatly enhanced by looking at non-human animals, visibilizing them, not making them off to the margins, putting them in there, recognizing them explicitly. They're persons also in the society. Considering power relations between humans and other animals, thinking critically about anthropocentrism. More technically, you might also move away from euphemistic language like meat, which, you know, meat is animals' flesh, it's body parts, or objectifying language like it. How much more objectifying can it be to turn a person into a thing? You might also think about whatever you're studying, how does animality influence those social relations? So if you specialize in race, class, gender, age, sexualization, those are things that you can be greatly enhanced by looking at the influence of animality. How have those persons and groups been animalized? And also how have non-human animals and their experiences been changed because of these other identity politics? For those of you who are doing the methodology of this, you want to think about also, can these animals consent? Can animals consent? So even thinking about them as research participants. This is a new area also of vegan sociology where people are exploring the methodological bit. And then you might also, consider starting an animal group for the Italian Association, Sociological Association. I think that would be just great if somebody wants to do that. So there you go. I will shut up now. I tried not to speak for 45 minutes, so I think I did. If you want more information, can I direct you then to vegansociology.com? That's where you'll find all kinds of stuff like this and more. And you are always welcome to send me an email if you want to chat about this, if you want to become a member, become a part of what we do. All right, I'm going to stop sharing screen.
Okay, so are you done?
I'm done.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And that was a very inspiring and rich and so empathic also talk. And we really, I really thank you for on the side of our department and for the public listening to the talk. And I just want to point and summarize some of the very interesting things that you said, although it's quite impossible to highlight everything, because that was so rich and so full of suggestions that I will only highlight some points. And at the same time, I'd like to ask you a couple of things, and then we can give space to the questions from the audience. Or someone already asked something in the chat, and I'll read some of the questions that have already been written. But first of all, let me say that what I think emerged from your presentation was the need to reconceive, I think, the objectives, the aims, and the methods of traditional sociology on the side of sociology, but also try to look at society broadly speaking, even though if you're not a sociologist, so you're not a scholar in the field, from another perspective. And what you said at the end of your talk was that we need to be more attentive to the language that we use, to the words that we use, as well as to the representation that we make use of. And you wrote a book about this. You wrote a book about, you wrote extensively on the, I would say, pornification of veganism, and also the way, and this is a very intersectional issue, because of course here feminism has a main role, a feminist approach. The way that images of animals also on the side of activists are used in order to impress and to visibilize some issues, while at the same time occluding and disguising some other ones that maybe are more important to show and to understand. And I would like you to expand on this. What do you mean with the term pornification of veganism? Also because I actually I have some difficulties in reading Carol Adams on this, because I think that sometimes her perspective is sort of against some things like sex work, or in general, I read among the lines sort of a condemnation of some issues that I think should be taken into account by feminist scholars. On the other hand, I don't read this in what you write, because you condemn, of course, the use of bodies, both of animals and of women, of female nudes, for example, but you do not conclude with the same tone and with the same position, I think, that Carol Adams assumes. But anyway, this was about the use of images and the use of words, which is a main theme in Carol Adams' essays as well. But what you said is also that veganism and vegan sociology is explicitly moral. And what I want to ask you, could we consider morality without politics? Could we consider a vegan approach that is mainly ethical without, and this is of course a rhetorical question, because somehow having read your books and your texts, I know that you talk about human supremacy and you talk about an intersectional approach, and you align with critical animal studies. So, but this is for the audience, I think, important to understand. Can we disjoin an ethical approach or a consideration of animals as sentient beings without taking into account the system of oppression, what Erica Cadworth, for example, calls anthroparchy, the system of domination that goes from the macro to the macro level and invests all the fields of our social life, and should be taken into account without only considering the ethical plane as something that comes before or is disjoint from this. So Marxism here, although with many limits, could be helpful. And also another thing that I really like of what you said, although you barely mentioned it, but you extensively wrote about it. It's the issue of or the relationship between rationality and a rational approach, and care and empathy. How can we maintain a scientific approach and at the same time make room for empathy and affectivity broadly intended, and not to devalue all those aspects that are usually considered feminine, and so not scientific and shouldn't be taken into account in science. And when reading a rational approach to animal rights, what came into my mind was, for example, the figuration of the modest witness that Donna Haraway talked about, the way that women have been left to the margins of the laboratory, the scientific laboratory, because of the need to be objective, of the need to be transparent, and of the need to make light without complicate and also without co-implicate, I would say, as with non-human animals. But I won't go further on this because there are so many things I'd like to ask you, but I want also to leave the audience the proper space to ask your questions. So thank you again, Corey.